Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this fundamental underlying expectation of precision,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
It's a lot like structural engineering in that way. Like
Mhm.
if you fall and break your arm, you go to the hospital, they put you in front of an X-ray machine, and a few minutes later, the doctor pulls up this high contrast image.
Right. The proof.
Exactly. There's a jagged white line cutting across the radius bone, and the doctor points at it and says, there it is. That is the break.
Yeah.
The reality of that situation is entirely independent of how anyone in the room feels about it. I mean, the bone doesn't care if the doctor is tired.
Right.
It doesn't care if you're anxious, and it certainly doesn't care about the sociological dynamics of the hospital staff,
No, it's just an objective, measurable fact. It's anchored in physical reality.
Exactly.
It's a binary state of existence. It's either broken or it's not broken. And that reliance on an external, verifiable truth, it's incredibly comforting.
Right, because it establishes a shared baseline for reality.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we built the entirety of the Enlightenment, the scientific method, our modern judicial systems, all on that exact premise. The idea that things can be made visible, categorized, and then tested against this unyielding standard.
But then you step outside of the hospital,
Right.
right? And you walk into the world of, say, modern relationships or contemporary gender dynamics, institutional politics.
Oh boy,
And suddenly you realize that the X-ray machine has just been completely dismantled,
just gone.
gone. The diagnostic landscape we are navigating today is, honestly, it's incredibly murky. We're dealing with these systems that seem to actively reject the idea of an objective baseline.
They absolutely do.
And instead, they recalibrate their rules based on who is speaking, who is listening, and, frankly, what the prevailing emotional weather happens to be on any given Tuesday.
Which creates a profound sense of disorientation.
Oh, for sure.
Because when the tools we use to diagnose reality are subjective and they're constantly shifting, you find yourself trying to navigate a maze where the walls literally rearrange themselves every time you take a step.
Every single time. And that profound disorientation is exactly why we are here today. So, welcome to another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are embarking on an ultra-long, forensic, and deeply incisive review of this fascinating new ebook that attempts to map out this exact phenomenon.
It really does.
The book is called One Truth, Two Standards, The Double Bind of Modern Gender Expectations by Sophie Marie Eve Riker.
Such a good read.
It is. Now, before we get into the heavy lifting, I need you to do us a huge favor. Hit that like and subscribe button right now. It really helps us carve a deeper channel for these deep dives in the algorithm,
Yeah, it makes a massive difference.
It really does. And listen, you are absolutely going to want to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy this ebook immediately, because no matter how deep we go today, we're only going to scratch the surface of the intense, granular, just analytical frameworks the author has laid out.
Oh, yeah. We can't cover it all.
Not even close. Also, make sure you follow the author's ongoing work at Conrad Riker on Substack.
You really have to. The level of rigorous mapping in this text,
Yeah,
it requires that kind of active, sustained engagement from the reader.
right.
It's definitely not a casual skim.
Far from it. I mean, if you have ever found yourself in a situation, whether that's in a private relationship or, say, a corporate boardroom where you felt like the rules of engagement just changed mid-sentence.
Which happens all the time.
Right. This book maps out the exact mechanical architecture of why that happens. It is an absolute must-read for anyone interested in understanding the history and the structural integrity of our institutions before they were fundamentally changed.
And arguably captured.
Yeah, captured by modern feminist and Marxist frameworks. That makes this text particularly fascinating for men seeking clarity in the modern world. It's a perspective that resonates deeply with men's rights advocates and really anyone within the manosphere who is trying to understand the blueprint of the current cultural landscape.
Which brings us to an absolutely critical piece of housekeeping we really need to establish right up front before we dive into the author's specific claims.
Yes, the mandatory impartiality disclaimer.
We have to say it.
We do. We want to explicitly state to you, the listener, that the source material we're unpacking today contains highly provocative, politically charged content that definitely challenges foundational narratives of our current culture.
Big time.
And we, as your guides on this show, we take absolutely no sides.
None at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the ultimate sociological conclusions of this book.
Right. Our mission on this show is strictly and ruthlessly analytical. We're acting as a conduit for the material. So our goal is to impartially report, unpack, and critically analyze the complex ideas contained in the original text.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
just going to take the author's arguments, lay them out on the workbench, and examine how the gears turn.
Just looking at the mechanics. So with that framework established, let's look at the mission overview for today.
Let's do it.
The primary goal is to understand the author's central concept, which she calls the double bind.
Right.
The book defines this double bind as this pervasive cultural and legal system where definitions constantly shift, specifically placing men in a position of perpetual liability without any corresponding authority.
Liability without authority, that's the key.
Yeah. We are going to trace the author's argument from the ground up, exploring how this dynamic originates in the most intimate private relationships, and then how it has successfully scaled up to capture corporate HR departments, the media, and modern academia.
And to understand how a system scales to the level of, say, a university or a Fortune 500 company, we really have to start at the bedrock of how that society defines truth.
Right, the foundation.
Yeah. The author opens the book with a profound philosophical critique of our current cultural epistemology.
And epistemology is just the study of how we acquire knowledge, right? How we determine what is factual.
Exactly. And the author argues that we have basically abandoned the pursuit of objective reality in favor of what the text calls the epistemology of mood.
The epistemology of mood. Wow. That suggests that society has stopped looking at the X-ray and just started asking the patient how the bone feels to determine if it is broken.
That's a perfect way to put it.
The book claims that subjective feelings, particularly the feelings of specific protected groups, are now treated as objective, unassailable facts.
Right.
And the author identifies a very specific, highly asymmetrical rule that governs this new reality. The rule is, my feelings are facts, yours are symptoms.
I want to break down the mechanics of that asymmetry because the author uses a formal logic structure to demonstrate how insidious this actually is.
Okay, let's hear it.
The book calls this the A not A autopsy.
A not A.
Yeah. So imagine a conflict between two people. We'll call the first scenario state A. The accuser in this dynamic is visibly distressed. Under the epistemology of mood, that emotional distress is not treated as a subjective internal state that requires, external investigation.
Right, it's not a clue.
No, it's treated as undeniable, empirical proof that a harmful action was committed by the accused. The feeling itself bypasses the need for evidence. The distress literally is the evidence.
I understand the mechanism of state A. The internal emotional weather report is submitted as the smoking gun.
Exactly.
But the asymmetry really crystallizes when we look at state not A. Like, what happens when the accused is specifically the man and the dynamics the author explores? What happens when he demonstrates the exact same emotional distress?
Oh, it flips completely. When the man expresses frustration, anger, or just profound distress over being accused, the system suddenly abandons the idea that feelings are facts.
Right.
His emotion is not treated as evidence of his innocence, nor is it viewed as a valid human reaction to a terrifying false charge.
So what happens to it?
It is immediately pathologized. It's framed as defensiveness, as toxic fragility, or, as a manipulative smokescreen designed to hide his underlying guilt.
Wow.
Yeah. The identical evidentiary mechanism, a strongly felt emotional experience, is treated as sacred, golden testimony when produced by the accuser, but it is dismissed as a psychiatric symptom when produced by the defendant.
The genius of that system, from a purely Machiavellian standpoint, is that it is entirely unfalsifiable.
Completely.
You cannot cross-examine a feeling. I mean, if I accuse you of stealing my car, we can check the security cameras, we can track the vehicle's GPS, we can look for physical keys.
Right, objective metrics.
But if I accuse you of making me feel unsafe through your mere presence or tone of voice, how do you disprove that?
You can.
You are forced into a position of trying to disprove a sensation occurring entirely within someone else's nervous system.
Which is an impossible standard to meet. By controlling whose emotions are permitted to define shared reality, one party completely bypasses the need for logic, reciprocity, and consistency. And the author provides a devastating real-world case study to illustrate how this exact epistemological shift destroyed a major institutional framework.
Which one?
The text points to the 2014 Rolling Stone article titled "A Rape on Campus" as the pristine laboratory specimen of this phenomenon.
Oh man, I remember the fallout from that vividly.
It's huge.
For those who might not recall the specifics, this was a massive bombshell piece of journalism published by a highly respected magazine. It detailed this horrific cinematic assault at a University of Virginia fraternity.
Right.
But the entire story collapsed under scrutiny because the underlying fact simply did not exist.
Exactly.
The author uses this not just as an example of bad journalism, but as a symptom of this broader epistemological disease.
Yeah, it's the mechanical failure in that newsroom that the book focuses on. The reporter, Sabrina Rubin Erdely, and her editors abandoned every single objective standard of journalism.
Every single one.
They did not verify the dates of the alleged party. They didn't check the weather records for the night in question, which actually contradicted the narrative.
Unbelievable.
And most egregiously, they actively chose not to interview the alleged perpetrators or even confirm they were members of that specific fraternity.
Wait, why wouldn't they check that?
Because the accuser, known as Jackie, expressed extreme emotional distress at the idea of the magazine contacting the accused.
So the institution of journalism prioritized the emotional comfort of the accuser over the physical, verifiable truth of the event.
Exactly.
They treated her mood as an unassailable fact.
And the cultural fallout was immediate and catastrophic. I mean, before any investigation could take place, the university suspended all fraternity activities, fraternity house was vandalized, and the lives of the accused students were completely upended.
Just ruined based on a feeling.
Yeah. The institution panicked because it could not withstand the moral weight of the emotional narrative. It was only later, when other journalists and the police actually checked the physical evidence, the X-ray, to use your metaphor, that it became clear the event, as described, never happened. The Columbia Journalism Review later published a devastating autopsy of the piece, calling it a systemic failure of journalistic practice.
But the author's core thesis is that despite the Rolling Stone article being exposed as a catastrophic failure, the underlying operating system of our culture didn't change.
No, not at all.
The system is still designed to prioritize the mood over the measurement.
Very much so.
Which brings me to a critical question. If an institution, whether it is a magazine, a university, or a court of law, cannot survive the equal objective application of its own rules, how does the author suggest a listener actually break this epistemological trap in their own life?
The solution proposed in the text is a return to rigorous, unapologetic epistemological hygiene.
Epistemological hygiene, I like that.
Yeah, you must demand a return to defining terms and testing evidence. The author insists that we must collectively relearn to treat emotion as a signal, not a sentence.
A signal, not a sentence.
Right. A feeling of danger, distress, or discomfort is incredibly valuable context. It is a biological signal that something in the environment needs to be investigated, but it is not the verdict of that investigation.
So you isolate the act from the emotion.
Yes.
When the feeling arises and an accusation is made, the immediate response must be, what specific, observable, externally verifiable action actually occurred in physical space and time.
And the author demands that this standard be applied symmetrically, regardless of the identity or the perceived systemic power of the person making the claim.
Okay, so it has to be a two-way street.
Exactly. Because if the rule applies uniformly, the incentive structure of the entire society shifts. Institutions can no longer outsource the hard work of verification to the whims of sentiment.
Right.
The moment the standard becomes reciprocal, the performance economy that thrives on competitive victimhood collapses, and truth returns to being a factual baseline rather than a highly weaponized political commodity.
Well, establishing that feelings are treated as facts is really only the first step. You need a vehicle to deliver those facts into the culture, right? You need a specialized vocabulary to legitimize and enforce this new reality, which leads us directly into the second major structural pillar of the book, the clinical coup, or the weaponization of therapy language.
This is where the book's analysis becomes incredibly surgical.
Yeah.
The text asserts that over the last 2 decades, clinical psychology terms, words that were painstakingly developed in highly specific controlled medical and therapeutic context to describe severe psychiatric pathology and profound drama.
Right, clinical terms.
Yeah, they have been systematically smuggled out of the clinic and into everyday life, but they haven't been brought into the culture to facilitate healing.
Oh.
The author argues they have been repurposed as tools for prosecution and social management.
Wow. And we are swimming in this vocabulary every single day. I mean, words like boundaries, gaslighting, toxic, narcissist, and unsafe.
All the time.
People use them as casually as they talk about the weather, but the author is pointing out that these words carry immense institutional weight.
They really do.
They aren't just descriptive, they are prescriptive. They dictate who is allowed to speak and who must remain silent.
This connects seamlessly back to the A not A dynamic. The author introduces the concept of pathologizing dissent.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, in a normal, healthy disagreement, governed by objective reality, two people clash over a structural or logical issue. Person A makes a point, person B offers a counter-argument based on evidence or logic.
Standard debate.
Right. But when therapy language is weaponized, the nature of the conflict instantly mutates.
Let's construct a hypothetical scenario to see how this works in practice.
Good idea.
Imagine a couple having a tense discussion about household finances. The man points out, using spreadsheet, that their current spending rate is unsustainable and they need to cut back on discretionary purchases.
Okay.
He is offering a structural logical argument based on math.
Yes, but under the clinical coup, the response to his spreadsheet is not a counter spreadsheet.
Right.
The response is a diagnosis. Instead of refuting his logic, his partner reframes his very act of disagreement as a symptom of a mental or emotional defect.
Wow.
Yeah, if he questions a specific purchase date on the timeline, he is accused of gaslighting. If he defends his intention behind bringing up the budget, he is told, "You're being defensive," or "You're intellectualizing your feelings to avoid vulnerability."
So the topic has completely shifted.
Entirely.
He is no longer debating the monthly budget. He is suddenly fighting for his life, defending his own sanity, his perception of reality, and his moral character against a pseudo-clinical accusation.
Exactly.
The rational mind just gets drowned in a flood of effective therapeutic noise.
The author describes this as the dynamic of the wounded healer versus the unexamined brute. The therapeutic language instantly captures the moral high ground. The woman in this dynamic occupies the unassailable position of the wounded healer. Her hypersensitivity, her anxiety about the budget conversation is framed by the culture as proof of her profound emotional depth and high emotional intelligence.
While the man, simply by virtue of asking for logical clarity and adherence to a mathematical budget, is cast as the unexamined brute.
Yes.
His demand for a verifiable standard is framed as proof of his psychological blindness, his toxic rigidity, and his lack of empathy.
Exactly.
He is placed on a perpetual treadmill where he must constantly prove he is not causing a psychic wound.
It's an exhausting dynamic.
I have to pause here and challenge the author's framing, though, because I think there is a risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Fair point.
Therapy language was originally designed for a vital purpose. It was to give victims of genuine, profound trauma a vocabulary to articulate very real harm that was previously invisible. It allowed people to name their abuse. Doesn't the author's total dismissal of this language risk killing the very empathy required for intimate human connection? Like, how does the book differentiate between someone genuinely setting a necessary, healthy psychological boundary and someone using the word boundary as, to quote the text, an imperial decree?
Right, and the author actually anticipates that exact critique.
Yeah.
The book does not argue that genuine trauma doesn't exist.
Okay.
The differentiation, according to the text, is found entirely in how the standard is applied. The test for legitimacy is reciprocity.
Reciprocity again.
Yeah. The author proposes a diagnostic tool called the sex swap standard. If a behavior is labeled as toxic or abusive when a man does it, you must apply the exact same label when a woman does it.
So applying that to the concept of boundaries.
If a woman's boundaries say, her demand that a certain topic never be discussed because it causes her anxiety, is treated as a sovereign, imperial decree that cannot be questioned without committing an act of violence.
Yeah.
What happens when the man establishes a boundary? If a man says, "I will not accept being yelled at in my own home, that is my boundary," is that honored with the same sacred reverence?
Oh, I see.
Or is it immediately attacked as him being controlling, avoidant, or stonewalling?
That is a piercing question. The author is suggesting that if the vocabulary only flows in one direction to secure leverage, it is not a therapeutic tool, it is a weapon of control.
Precisely. And the author's tactical advice for dealing with this is clinical in its precision.
What do they recommend?
When you are hit with a buzzword like gaslighting, the imperative is to aggressively refuse the premise of mind reading. You must demand exact quotes, chronological timelines, and operational definitions.
So you just stop the conversation.
You stop the conversation and say, what specific reality distortion occurred? Give me the exact sentence I said, the time I said it, and how it contradicts the verifiable fact.
Wow.
You force the language out of the hazy realm of vague, unassailable emotion and drag it kicking and screaming back into the realm of observable, measurable behavior.
And once you understand how language is used to secure the moral high ground and dictate the terms of reality, you start to see how that linguistic leverage is converted into tangible, physical, and economic extraction.
Exactly, the material reality.
The book makes a brilliant pivot here, moving from the epistemology of the mind into the economics of the household. This takes us to the third core concept, the provision paradox and the covert contract.
We're transitioning from how reality is defined to how resources, money, time, labor, and physical safety are allocated based on those definitions.
Right.
The author introduces the provision paradox to describe the glaring contradiction at the heart of modern heterosexual relationships.
What's the paradox?
The paradox is the societal expectation that men will continue to fulfill their traditional roles, funding the household, absorbing the occupational hazards of the workforce, and underwriting the financial lifestyle, while their economic output is simultaneously stripped of its historical value.
The author describes male economic output in the modern era as a default patriarchal tax. What does that actually mean in practice?
Well, under historical traditional paradigms, male provision was explicitly understood as a sacrifice. A man surrendered his time, his physical health, and his labor to the marketplace, and in exchange, that sacrifice required structural gratitude, respect, and a reciprocal deference within the family unit.
It was an explicit deal.
It was a negotiated exchange. The author claims that in the modern paradigm, the expectation of that provision remains entirely intact, but the gratitude has been systematically abolished by feminist frameworks.
So the provision becomes invisible.
Exactly. It is taxed as a baseline expectation of his existence, but it is never credited as a sacrifice that earns him any reciprocal authority.
Which brings us to the architecture of the covert contract. The author argues that modern relationships are failing at such a high rate because they are built on unspoken expectations that generate fabricated, retroactive obligations.
Right. A covert contract is a psychological dynamic where one person believes they have an agreement with another person, but they have never actually communicated the terms of that agreement.
Oh, that sounds dangerous.
Very. The modern relational ledger doesn't run on explicit negotiated terms. It runs on whispered expectations, cultural assumptions, and the quiet terror of guessing your partner's unstated needs.
The classic nice guy syndrome is a perfect example of a covert contract in action, and the author breaks this down as a fundamentally flawed economic strategy.
Oh, yeah.
The nice guy operates on this hidden premise, like, if I suppress my own needs, if I am endlessly accommodating, and if I provide infinite utility and emotional support without ever demanding anything in return, I will eventually be rewarded with desire, intimacy, and loyalty.
But the author views this as a moralistic fallacy. The nice guy believes his internal superficial good intentions will guarantee a payout.
Right.
But he is crashing headfirst into a systemic standard that continuously moves specifically to evade accountability. He exhausts himself trying to pay down an emotional invoice that has no maximum limit because the terms of the contract were never explicitly defined in the first place.
The book contrasts the nice guy with a forensic audit of the strong, independent woman archetype. The author suggests this cultural trope functions beautifully on a Hollywood movie poster, but collapses entirely under operational scrutiny in the real world.
The author argues the archetype is a structural contradiction. It essentially demands that a man fund the lifestyle, absorb the career interruptions, and maintain the financial runway, so that the woman can exercise absolute unfettered autonomy over her life choices.
Right.
Without ever bearing the harsh financial consequences of those choices.
Let's ground this in a very specific real-world scenario to test the author's logic.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's say a modern egalitarian couple is buying a house. The woman demands that her name be on the deed as an equal co-owner, citing her independence and equality.
Makes sense on paper.
Right. But when it comes to the down payment and the 30-year mortgage, there is an unspoken expectation that the man will pay the lion's share out of his salary, while she retains her income as discretionary fund money or personal savings.
Right, and the book asks a very pointed, uncomfortable question about that exact scenario. What does independence actually mean when the rent is due?
Wow.
The author argues that you cannot demand to be a co-CEO of a company, wielding total equal authority over all strategic decisions, but then flatly refuse to sign your name to the business loans or absorb the catastrophic financial risk if the company goes bankrupt.
Yeah, that's not equality.
If you have the authority of a CEO but the financial liability of an intern, you are not an independent partner. You are a dependent utilizing leverage.
The author actually calls this a syllogism audit. If male provision is historically deemed a tyrannical imposition of patriarchal control, as many feminist frameworks argue, but a modern woman still covertly demands that a man provide for her and shield her from financial risk, then she is explicitly demanding tyranny.
She just wants the tyranny to subsidize her lifestyle.
Exactly. And the author's takeaway for the listener is uncompromising. You must open the hidden ledger. Men are advised to stop funding a system that treats their labor and their life force as a public utility. The author argues that a man must draw a hard boundary around his labor and require strict operational definitions of equality before committing resources.
What does that look like?
Like, if a relationship is truly a 50-50 egalitarian partnership, what does that mathematical split look like when the medical bills arrive or the roof needs replacing?
Yeah.
A modern woman can absolutely keep her total independence, but she must pay the full, unvarnished market price for it. And a modern man can offer his provision, but he must demand the authority, respect, and deference that historically matches that sacrifice.
So true.
Now, if that hidden ledger forces men to bear financial risk in private, what happens when we zoom out?
The macro level.
Right. What happens when we take that exact same dynamic and apply it to physical risk in the public square? How does the expectation of male protection survive when male authority is stripped away? This takes us to the fourth major concept, the safety double bind and the independence siphon.
We are moving from the microeconomics of the household to the macro infrastructure of civilization. The author contrasts two concepts here to illustrate the shift. The historical paradigm of protective versus the modern accusation of controlling.
Okay.
And to truly understand this, the text requires us to look back at the historical common law doctrine of coverture.
Coverture. That's a concept that gets heavily criticized in modern historical analysis. Walk us through how the author interprets its actual mechanics.
Well, under the historical doctrine of coverture, a woman's legal rights and obligations were subsumed by those of her husband upon marriage.
Right.
Modern frameworks view this purely as an oppressive erasure of female agency.
Sure.
But the author argues we have to look at the other side of the ledger. Under coverture, a man assumed total legal, financial, and physical liability for his household.
Total liability.
Yes, if his wife incurred a massive debt, the husband was legally forced to pay it. If she committed certain types of civil torts or slander, the husband could be sued or even imprisoned for her actions.
So he was the absolute legal shock absorber for the entire family unit.
Exactly. But in exchange for assuming that crushing total liability, the common law granted him unilateral authority over the household's affairs.
No, I see the reciprocity.
He controlled the finances and the decisions because he was the one who would go to a debtor's prison if those decisions failed. The author calls this a ruthless arithmetic of reciprocity. Authority inherently followed responsibility.
But the author's argument is that modern culture has completely severed authority from responsibility.
Completely.
Society has retained the expectation of total male liability, particularly regarding physical safety, but has successfully branded any attempt by men to exercise authority to manage that safety as controlling or abusive.
Think of a man as the main structural load-bearing beam holding up the roof of a house.
Okay.
He is expected to bear the weight. If a storm comes and the beam flexes to try and manage the weight, say, by the man setting a strict boundary about risk tolerance or telling his partner not to walk through a dangerous neighborhood at 2 a.m., he is immediately labeled controlling, insecure, or victim-blaming.
Wow.
But if the beam snaps, if he fails to protect her, and violence occurs, he is labeled negligent or less of a man.
You cannot decouple authority from responsibility without engineering a disaster.
You really can't.
If a man is held socially and legally accountable for the physical safety of an environment, but he is expressly forbidden from adjusting the variables that determine that safety, he is caught in an impossible double bind.
The author uses the modern weaponization of the word unsafe to illustrate this. A disagreement over risk tolerance is no longer treated as a difference of opinion. It is classified as an existential threat to female autonomy.
Unbelievable.
But true autonomy, the author notes, is inextricably linked to the capacity for violence and physical risk.
Which brings us to a concept that completely reframes the modern aesthetic of empowerment. The book introduces the independence siphon.
The independent siphon.
Yeah, the illusion of female independence that is entirely funded and subsidized by invisible male risk. And the author brings receipts.
Hard data.
The text quotes a stark, unyielding statistic from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In 2022, men accounted for 92.2% of all fatal work injuries in the United States.
Wow. That statistic is the anchor of the author's entire macro argument. Those aren't abstract data points on a spreadsheet. They represent the brute, terrifying physical risk required to maintain the foundational infrastructure of modern society.
The people keeping the lights on.
Exactly. We are talking about deep-sea commercial crabbing in the Bering Sea, maintaining high-voltage power lines during winter storms, offshore oil drilling, heavy logging, and the sanitation systems that prevent cholera outbreaks.
The author employs the psychological concept of the Dunning-Kruger effect to explain why modern society is so blind to this. The Dunning-Kruger effect is this cognitive bias where people with very low ability or knowledge in a specific domain drastically overestimate their competence.
Right.
The author argues that modern urbanites suffer from a civilizational Dunning-Kruger effect regarding physical survival.
The text calls it unassociativeness. A digital entrepreneur sitting in a climate-controlled artisanal coffee shop, running a marketing consulting business from her MacBook, genuinely believes she is a wholly independent, self-made entity.
Sure.
She flips a switch and the lights come on. She turns a tap and clean water flows. She assumes civilization is essentially a software program that runs itself.
Oh, wow.
She completely dissociates her comfortable existence from the 92.2% male workforce that is actively dying in industrial accidents to keep the servers running and the supply chains moving.
The author calls this a satanic inversion of objective merit. How exactly does this system perpetuate itself?
The book argues that the state has stepped in to act as a surrogate husband.
The surrogate husband.
Yeah. Through the mechanism of progressive taxation, massive amounts of wealth are violently extracted, backed by the threat of state force, right from these highly dangerous, overwhelmingly male logistical sectors. That extracted wealth is then redistributed to fund grants, preferential business loans, diversity initiatives, and administrative safety nets that artificially inflate the aesthetic of female corporate independence.
So reliance is brilliantly marketed as superiority.
Exactly.
Dependence on the state and male infrastructure is reframed as fierce empowerment. The aesthetic of the self-made digital nomad drives massive consumer spending while remaining entirely unburdened by the grim physical reality of the resources keeping her enterprise afloat.
And the author's mandate to the listener caught in this safety double bind is radical. Men must reclaim the absolute right to withdraw their protection if their authority is mocked.
Wow, withdraw protection.
Protection is not an infinite, unconditioned natural resource like air. It is a reciprocal covenant. If the conditions required for a man to safely provide are actively dismantled and ridiculed by the person demanding that provision, the provider must be permitted to step back, let the consequences fall where they may, and refuse to be branded a villain.
Wow, okay. So if the historical pillars of duty, objective merit, and reciprocal protection are discarded, nature still abhors a vacuum. Something has to replace them.
Something always does.
That takes us to Section 5, the accountability void and the grievance economy. The author argues that when duty dies, it is replaced by the relentless pursuit of fleeting happiness and the literal monetization of trauma.
We see the mechanics of this most clearly in the author's sociological analysis of modern relationship dissolution.
Breakups and divorces.
Right. The book argues that over the last 50 years, there has been a complete collapse of the threshold required for abandonment.
The threshold is gone.
Historically, dissolving a marriage or a partnership required a measurable, severe breach of contract, documented infidelity, physical abuse, or total abandonment of provision. Today, the threshold has been lowered to the mere presence of an inconvenient or stagnant mood.
And the text points to a very specific, massive cultural touchstone to perfectly encapsulate this shift. Elizabeth Gilbert's 2006 mega best-selling memoir, Eat, Pray, Love.
The author dissects that book not merely as a piece of literature, but as the foundational religious text for a new cultural archetype.
Oh, absolutely.
Eat, Pray, Love taught an entire generation to mistake the abandonment of duty for a heroic act of self-discovery.
Right.
It culturally celebrated and legitimized a woman's decision to leave a perfectly adequate husband and a stable home, not because of any measurable harm or abuse, but simply because she felt a vague sense of internal malaise and wanted to pursue self-actualization in Italy and Bali.
Let's examine the underlying philosophical syllogism the author identifies here. The shift from a framework of duty to a framework of self-actualization.
The structural flaw in that philosophy is profound.
Yeah.
If you genuinely believe that personal subjective happiness is the highest moral good a human being can pursue, and you believe that a vow like a marriage vow is strictly conditional on your continuous emotional satisfaction, you have engineered a system doomed to fail. Because human emotion and satisfaction are inherently volatile, cyclical, and influenced by 1,000 external factors. Therefore, the vow possesses absolutely zero structural integrity.
It's just a feeling.
Marriage devolves from a lifelong covenant into a temporary lease agreement, governed entirely by the whims of emotional tendency.
If a temporary dip in morale or a midlife crisis becomes legally and culturally acceptable grounds for the total demolition of a family unit, the ledger turns violently against the person who remains anchored to the archaic concept of duty.
And the author connects this to a fascinating psychological concept they call the negative animus.
A negative animus.
This is the idea that when an individual pursues endless self-actualization and inevitably finds that they are still unhappy, that unexamined internal discontent, that relentless inner critic must be projected outward.
Right, they have to blame someone.
It is often projected directly onto the male partner. A woman might mistake the inescapable echo of her own internal dissatisfaction for the tyranny of her husband.
She turns private, internal neurosis into public, legal procedure.
Precisely. And in spaces like family courts or corporate HR departments, the subjective feeling of being stifled or harmed is granted the exact same legal and procedural weight as an actual physical act of harm.
That is terrifying.
The man is no longer judged by what he demonstrably did. He is treated as a standing existential threat, judged entirely by how his mere presence makes someone feel.
Which feeds directly into what the author brilliantly terms the grievance economy, the idea of selling the wound.
Selling the wound.
The author is asserting that trauma, victimhood, and grievance have literally become a fiat currency in modern society.
They really have.
This currency trades in attention, social capital, HR protection, and absolute compliance. But the book points out the dark, inevitable outcome of this economic model. If everyone is allowed to print their own grievance money, the currency hyperinflates and destroys the social fabric.
It has to.
And worse, it requires the injury to persist forever as a subscription service. You can never actually heal, or you lose your capital. How does a listener practically refuse to pay this endless emotional invoice?
The author's praxis rule here is cold, clinical, and uncompromising. You must evaluate individuals, whether partners, colleagues, or institutions, strictly on their current actions, their measurable outputs, and their adherence to explicitly stated responsibilities.
No exceptions.
You absolutely do not evaluate them based on what they claim to have suffered in the past. The wound, no matter how tragic, does not entitle anyone to your present labor, your assets, or your silence.
Wow.
When someone presents a historical grievance to win a current structural argument, you refuse to orbit the emotion. You audit the behavior.
Refuse to orbit the emotion, audit the behavior. That is a phenomenal operating principle.
It is.
So, we have covered the epistemological, the linguistic, the private economics of the home, and the psychological mechanisms. Now we must look at the macro level. In Section 6, Institutional Capture, we finally examine how these individual paradoxes and shifting ledgers have successfully scaled up to completely capture the massive institutions that govern public life, academia, and the corporate workplace.
The author points the analytical lens first at the university system, specifically focusing on the replication crisis in the social sciences.
The replication crisis is one of the most underreported scandals of the century.
Oh, absolutely.
For context, this is the devastating realization that a massive percentage of foundational studies in psychology and sociology studies that shaped public policy cannot be reproduced by other scientists when they run the exact same experiments.
The math simply does not hold up.
It doesn't.
And the author hones in on very specific casualties of this crisis, namely the concepts of stereotype threat and implicit bias.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Let's look at the implicit association test, or IAT, which was designed to prove that everyone harbors deep, unconscious racism or sexism. The text argues that this test was heralded by the media and academia as incontrovertible scientific proof of a hidden, malicious patriarchy.
Right, everyone took it.
But under rigorous psychometric testing, the IAT showed abysmal test-retest reliability.
Meaning what?
Meaning, if you take the test on Tuesday, you might be scored as highly biased. But if you take it on Thursday, you score as completely unbiased. It is statistically useless for predicting actual discriminatory behavior.
Yet, despite the math failing completely, the ideological apparatus built on top of that flawed science remains unshaken.
Completely unshaken.
The author claims that universities are actively manufacturing the illusion of systemic oppression to justify the massive parasitic expansion of their own administrative bureaucracies.
That is the core of the institutional critique. The author details how the modern academy operates functionally, like an unfalsifiable conspiracy theory.
Just like the epistemology of mood.
Exactly. If researchers find instances of bias, it's presented as proof of the theory. But if they run a study and find absolutely zero evidence of bias, that absence is not viewed as a positive outcome.
It's viewed as proof of concealment.
Yes, it is viewed as additional, terrifying proof of how thoroughly the patriarchal structure conceals itself. It is a closed loop of paranoia.
Heads I win, tails you lose. And the author points out the staggering financial ledger hidden beneath this. Trillions of dollars in non-dischargeable student debt.
Trillions.
Working class families liquidate decades of labor to purchase academic credentials that, according to the book, no longer signal technical competence, but merely signal ideological conformity.
Exactly.
Every new diversity office, every new inclusion initiative requires millions in funding, new staff, and endless bureaucratic expansion. The grievance industry institutionalizes problems because solving them would destroy their own business model.
And this exact same ideological virus has bled completely over into the corporate sector.
Right into HR.
The author describes corporate HR as the new morality police. The book argues that modern HR departments no longer act as risk mitigation for the company. They act as an ideological enforcement mechanism driven by ESG scores rather than actual revenue generation or product excellence.
Let's unpack ESG because this is the mechanical engine driving the corporate shift. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. Why does a CEO care more about a social score than building a better widget?
Because of how capital flows.
Yeah.
Massive institutional asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street control trillions of dollars in passive index funds.
So they have the power.
They hold the proxy voting power for those shares. They use that immense leverage to force corporate boards to adopt strict diversity quotas, expand HR departments, and adhere to specific social ideologies.
Wow.
If a company refuses, the asset managers can dump their stock or vote out the board. They bypass the consumer market entirely.
So you have a corporate dynamic where executives eagerly fund massive diversity departments to construct liability shields against lawsuits and to appease these institutional investors holding the ESG purse strings.
It's just a shakedown.
The executive gets a multi-million-dollar bonus for hitting a diversity target, but the actual engineers, the brilliant, sometimes eccentric people producing the actual value of the company, are treated as collateral damage.
They really are.
They are the ones penalized, fired, or sidelined for lacking soft skills or for disrupting the emotional equilibrium of the office when they insist on high technical standards. Competence is traded for optics. But this raises a truly probing question. If these policies are genuinely as detrimental to efficiency, innovation, and product quality as the author claims,
Right.
if they fundamentally destroy competence, why hasn't the brutal reality of the free market corrected this? Why do massive corporations continue to lean into frameworks that the author says are mathematically broken?
Well, the author's prediction is that the market will correct it, but the timeline will be brutal.
A brutal correction.
Organizations that optimize for secondary characteristics like grievance, compliance, ideological purity, and theatrical victimhood over primary technical capability will ultimately be buried by international competition that does not play these games.
They can't survive.
No. The author argues that you cannot mandate that a less qualified candidate be promoted to design an airplane or manage a power grid without eventually degrading the safety and function of the product.
It's physics.
Exactly. The solution for the listener navigating this is to step back from the corporate theater. Build the product, measure the output, honor the hard evidence. Let the function decide.
Let the function decide. That brings us to our outro and the ultimate overarching solution the author proposes for the listener who feels trapped in this matrix. The author calls this the logos restoration, or the methodology for escaping what they call the pretense world.
Throughout the text, the author contrasts the pretense world as modern landscape, where feelings dictate reality, where definitions shift based on identity, and where accountability is perpetually outsourced, with the unforgiving bedrock of actual physical reality.
Right.
The logos restoration is a demand to return to first principles.
And the author advocates for a very specific, actionable tool to achieve this, the return to a classical masculine mode of speech.
The author describes this mode of communication as clinical, direct, and entirely unapologetic.
Unapologetic.
It does not meander to protect feelings. It does not over-explain or justify its own existence. The imperative for the listener is to relentlessly define terms before engaging in any debate. Enforce chronological timelines. Demand falsifiable evidence for every accusation.
So if an HR representative or a partner claims that a new policy or a boundary will improve outcomes or create safety, you do not nod along.
Never.
You ask for the specific mechanical mechanism of action, like how exactly does X lead to Y?
And crucially, you apply the sex swap test to every single rule, social norm, and legal precedent.
Right, the reciprocity test.
If a rule cannot survive being applied universally and equally to both men and women, it is not justice. It is merely leverage wearing the mask of equality.
Wow.
The author urges men to stop apologizing for their own clarity. Do not validate the fog. Let the inherent contradictions of the modern world multiply until they collapse under their own impossible weight.
Let the contradictions multiply until they collapse. This brings us full circle right back to our opening metaphor. The broken X-ray machine, the muddy waters of modern diagnosis.
Right.
The author is essentially saying, stop trying to read an X-ray that the hospital administration keeps intentionally smudging. Build your own yardstick, stand firmly on the unyielding line of objective reality, and let those who wish to live in the pretense world exhaust themselves fighting gravity.
Because the truth is completely indifferent to the narrative. It just waits.
It just waits, which leaves us with a final, deeply provocative thought to ponder. Building on everything we've unpacked today, from the epistemological corruption and the provision paradox to the safety double bind and the corporate capture of the grievance economy,
It's a lot.
if our institutions have truly swapped the rigorous pursuit of objective truth for the endless management of subjective moods, as the author meticulously argues, what happens to the physical infrastructure of our civilization when the people who actually know how to build, maintain, and protect it simply decide to stop apologizing and walk away?
Yeah.
What happens when the structural beam finally decides it is tired of being called controlling and just lets go?
It is a question of structural integrity on a civilizational scale.
It really is. And on that sobering note, we have to remind you that this deep dive barely scratched the surface of the intense forensic analysis provided in this book.
Barely scratched it.
If this discussion resonated with you, if you are looking for clarity in a world that feels increasingly unmoored from reality, head over to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books immediately to buy One Truth, Two Standards: The Double Bind of Modern Gender Expectations by Sophie Marie Eve Riker.
The author provides a staggering amount of detailed mapping, historical context, and tactical advice that we simply didn't have time to cover.
Absolutely. And to continue exploring these massive cultural shifts in real time, make sure you subscribe to the author's Substack at Conrad Riker. Follow the discourse there to stay updated on how these frameworks are evolving. Also, be sure to follow Conrad Riker on Twitter and Conrad Riker on YouTube.
Definitely check those out.
Finally, one last reminder to like and subscribe to this show. Your support helps the algorithm carve a deeper channel for more deep dives just like this one. Thanks for listening. Keep demanding the evidence and keep questioning the narrative.